Hello, and welcome back to Leadership Reimagined, where we're redefining leadership for the modern world. I'm excited to introduce today's guest, a strategic advisor and leader with extensive experience in national security, tech, and data. His career reflects a commitment to making a real impact, whether during his career as an Army officer or helping innovative companies address critical challenges. Today, we're going to talk about his experience in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and how his efforts remind us of what it means to put others first. So please join me in welcoming Trevor Huff. Hi, Trevor.
Looking forward to the conversation, and good morning.
Yeah, good morning. I really thought your response to the storm individually was just a great example of what it looks like to put others first. So you also came into contact with some great organizations out there that are impacting people's lives in big ways. I would just love to have a conversation about what it was like for you after the storm, what inspired you to step up, and how you came to some of those solutions to help people in need.
Thank you, Cassie, and appreciate that. Just for, I think, to set the stage for folks who aren't in this part of the country, listeners who didn't experience it. We're talking Hurricane Helene hit about 6 weeks ago, I guess now, at the very end of September, beginning of October. And where we are in the upstate of South Carolina, the eye passed just to the west of us. So we had extremely strong winds, a lot of rain damage, but winds really did an effect on South Carolina. Thousands of power lines down, trees down. It's a very heavily wooded area, rolling terrain. We lost power for about 9 days, and we lost internet for about 2.5 weeks. As you move further north into North Carolina, into the Asheville area that many listeners may have seen on TV or on internet, they received just an incredible deluge of rain in addition to the wind. But the rain is really what affected them because the mountains are very steep there. They're the highest mountains east of the Mississippi. And you ended up with rain not having anywhere to go and flooding the rivers and the creeks and the streams. So flooding really impacted North Carolina to a heavy degree, knocking out sewer, knocking out power, knocking out water systems. Sometimes a mountain community might have only one bridge in and out that was knocked out. And so they're left to try to find their way to safety or to a health facility or whatever it is that they may need. So I thought it helpful to really set that stage for people as we talk about this. Immediately afterwards, I think a lot of people started to do self-assessment in terms of where their house was, where their family was. We had a lot of our neighborhood had trees on tops of houses, on tops of cars, sheds. We were very blessed. We didn't have any of that necessarily on our property, although we lost trees. They happened to not hit anything on their way down. And that was more or less luck of the draw, just the way things worked out. We couldn't get out of our area we live in because of trees blocking the roads. I think the first action in any situation like that is first and foremost, or can I leave my house and go help other people because everything's intact? And once you move past that, it becomes, okay, what is the next right thing I can do to help the situation? The situation's so enormous. The impacts and the hurt and the damage is so enormous across such a wide area. You can't tackle it all at once. And I think sometimes people will, no fault of their own, see a problem that big, and it might be in business, it might be in life, it might be in a natural disaster, and they think, I can't do anything to affect it. I'm just one person or a couple of people. In this situation, I saw myself, a couple of others, grab their chainsaws, grab your leaf blower, your weed whacker, your axe, whatever you had to try to move the needle to help people. And maybe that's cutting down some branches so that they can get in and out physically in and out of their house because it's blocked by a tree. Maybe it's clearing the roads so that trucks can get in and out when the bigger trees are moved off the roads. And maybe it's working as a team to try to cut a path out of the neighborhood so that if, God forbid, a fire truck or an ambulance needs to get in, they could. And then past that, if people needed to do that to get fuel, to get food, water. So I think the big focus was trying to figure out what are those immediate steps I can take, do those, and then build out from there as you try to impact as many people as you can, as fast as you can.
What a sobering reminder to sort of put on your own oxygen mask first in a crisis so that you can help others. I'm really curious about, what went through your mind as you were considering how to respond. I've heard some of it, but how did you determine what needed to be done first?
In the first and foremost concern was for, we happen to have a fair amount of older neighbors. And so first and foremost was making sure that they were okay, that in the storm, a tree hadn't, because we had lost all communication, so no cell, no nothing. So
Mhm.
they weren't able, if they were in trouble, they couldn't have called or texted anyone. I quickly got out at the tail end of the storm. Winds were still blowing, the rain had subsided some, to walk the streets and see if I could see any damage out there. And other people, again, certainly not the only one who was doing this, some other like-minded people were out there, but a lot of people understandably were staying in their house to shelter, because you have so much rain and so much wind and so many high trees where we live that it would not have been a surprise. And it did happen, where you think the storm's over and then you have just a gust of wind. It takes one, and the saturated ground and the tree comes over, and you have people getting hurt. So taking care and making sure that people were alive, that people still had intact, structurally viable roofs over their heads, and that they had, if they needed something in particular, if it was water, if it was medicine, if it was food, whatever the case was. We were lucky to have a generator, so we quickly allowed our older neighbors, if they needed to charge hearing aids, if they needed to charge very important things. We even had at one point a portable defibrillator charging in the house, as people needed to have those things just to sustain themselves moving forward. And then past that, once you figure out people's, it's almost a kind of a Maslow hierarchy of needs sort of thing. Like, you have your basic house intact. Okay, now let's see, is there a place where we can go and just quickly get a pipe moved, a fan in operation, so that if flooding can be remediated, that sort of thing. And then it was quickly to the hard labor of moving trees, because that was the big thing, both again for emergency vehicles getting in and out if need be, but also for the power line repair, for internet repair, for everything that needed to happen. We had to get the big trees moved off the road. And this is a great example of, in a situation like this, and I like the analogy of putting your oxygen mask on first. No one's coming for you to help in these situations. Area is so widespread. The public safety, the emergency crews, the tree workers, the power line workers, all those folks, they're in a situation themselves, especially our local teams here. And ultimately, the nation, really the continent, I guess, rallied around us. We had power companies from Ontario, from Quebec, from Maine, from all over the place, from where I'm from up in New York. Like, they got here pretty quick. That was remarkable. But for those first 72, 96 maybe hours, it's what you can do and your friends and family and neighbors can do to make a positive impact. So again, make sure your houses are okay. And then from there, move out and try to get roads open so that people can go. And if there is a store open a few miles down the road, they might be able to get over there and get food or water, medicine, et cetera.
It's so clear that your military training in terms of responding to crisis, like, it's great that you have that framework of thinking about what's most important here. What do people need? Communication, right? Power, all of that. So you're out here, there's no cell service, there's no power. So how are you communicating with people? How are you organizing all these efforts? You, the
Right.
community, everybody.
It's a great example of, I think it's important to, in today, I think so many of our communities don't do a good job of having those communal bonds that maybe in earlier generations you had. And so in the military, there was an expression, certainly in the special operations community, where you can't surge trust. When a crisis takes place, you can't all of a sudden show up and say, "Hey, you don't know me,
Mhm.
but trust me, I'm going to help." You can't surge that. You have to have it existing beforehand. And so I think for our community, we had a good amount of social engagement, be that walking your dog and saying hi, but then get togethers on the front porch or a holiday party or whatever the case was. There was strong communal bounds, connections with
Mhm.
each other. And so that allowed for us quickly to move around and talk to people. And we weren't strangers. We weren't even just like, everybody probably has a neighbor where you're like, I've never really talked to that person other than a cursory, hi, how are you in the morning? We have some of those too. They clearly needed help, but they didn't know us. They didn't, even if communications had worked, they didn't have our number. And maybe they felt a little reluctant because they didn't have those connections ahead of time. And so they maybe didn't benefit from the community coming together. And ultimately, obviously, we checked on them and made sure they were okay. but immediately you were walking around, knocking on doors, talking to people, and it was people you talked to most every day anyways. And then you met some new people too, a good side effect of it. But that was the way you did it. You really had to communicate early and frequently to say, hey, our generators work and come over, and we have this, and someone else would say, oh, I have this, and I went to Amazon or I ordered my body weight batteries, and so come on over and get. And so everybody kind of leaned in and shared and communicated that way. Cell service would come up a little bit at night and then drop again. It's similar if you ever try to make a call from a concert or a football game. Everybody's on the same cellular infrastructure and it just doesn't work. I realized I could start making texts around 9, 10 o'clock at night, only if I was on the back porch in the right corner. That's the only place I could hit a cell tower. And so we'd also use that to communicate with each other at night if need be.
And humans will always find that cell service, won't they?
They will, especially in the situation where you have friends and family all over the country and you're trying to keep people updated on what's going on. So yeah, we will find it. And credit to the companies around here. They did their best to try to get power and cell service back soon, but it just was way bigger than they could handle in terms of the storm.
Yeah, it's an incredible lift. And so now, we've talked a little bit about your local response. Talk to me a little bit about your thinking and how you ended up sort of venturing out of your immediate community and what that looked like.
Yeah. So after you get your local area in a position where you can move, you're sharing information. Hey, this store is open, only accepting cash because nobody's credit card machines were working. And so you're trying to share that information. If you have cell service, you might text it, or you just drive by and tell people. And if you're making a run to the store, you ask everybody what they need. And I think everybody did a very good job of that. But quickly, you move out, and if you have friends, that community aspect is enormous. It might be broader than your neighborhood, and you may have church friends or social friends or whatever in a different part of the community. You're reaching out to them to try to say, hey, how are you doing? Do you need anything? And you're expanding that footprint of trying to help each other. And again, it's about not tackling the whole thing at once. It's trying to help here and there to where you can improve the situation. So had a friend a few miles away whose cars got hit. His house did not, but a fence on his property was devastated. And he had some livestock and stuff. So we went over and helped cut him out a little bit. But after a little while, if you've handled what's happening in your immediate area, there comes a time when you try to hopefully realize you can provide assistance for people a little further afield. And that's when we decided to go spend some time up in North Carolina and then in other places here also in South Carolina where we thought we could make a difference.
I'm hearing such a theme of, build the community and the relationships in a time of peace, right? That
Yeah.
you're going to need in a time of crisis. And I'm just really curious about how this experience is different than having the weight of national resources behind you. And most importantly, what you're learning about yourself and your own leadership since
Yeah.
leaving the military.
It's a great question. When I was in the Army, everything was focused on my unit, my servicemen and women I was serving with, not much focus on the greater community wherever I was living. You were there, and as you know, you move around, and so you don't necessarily develop real strong community ties because you didn't know when you're going to move next and you're deploying. Your focus is really on the installation of what you're living and the activities of whatever unit you're in. And so I think in leaving the military and having the opportunity to establish connections and roots into a community has been huge because I didn't have that before. And so now having the opportunity to help neighbors, for them to help us, and to really work together, that's been enormous, certainly on active duty. And then the other part is just really, I had a different career path, probably a better way to put it, where I was often part of smaller teams, and those teams work together to solve, really complex problems. And so being able to assess what are the needs of a small organization and how that small organization is going to impact the larger mission is something I think I carried over from my time on active duty. And then just trying to anticipate what are the things that could upend what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that also carries over from time in the military. And I think it very applicable to the business world. How do you think about risk? risk to your mission, risk to yourself and your team? And then where can you mitigate that? Where can you buy that down? To your point, Cassie, earlier, how do you build those relationships in the business world if you're worried about maybe a cyber attack or supply chain management risks? How do you think about those things ahead of time, build the relationships so when those things do happen, and in today's world, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. How do you mitigate it to keep your team and your company moving forward? And then on the personal side and your communities, how do you, again, have those relationships? How do you anticipate the risk that could happen and put in place those things that can mitigate it? And then afterwards, how do you go out and affect positive change kind of one step at a time?
Yeah. And as you think about risk mitigation, thinking about the future, you do a lot of work in innovation for companies. So, what advice would you give leaders about the value of innovation and adaptability when resources are limited and stakes are high?
It's a great point. Early on, about day one of the storm, I wish I would have thought about it ahead of time. And this is probably a hit on me, not realizing how susceptible the internet and cell structures were to a big storm, a storm of this magnitude, and a little bit guilty of never having lived through, despite being stationed in places like Texas and Louisiana. And so, in hindsight, I would have got a Starlink system earlier as opposed to waiting to day two of the storm. But I went ahead and took a shot, a gamble, and ordered one, thinking I'm not real sure if the UPS truck's going to show up with it or not, but it did. So that gave us the opportunity to have robust communication, cellular and internet. And then when some colleagues and I went ahead and went up to North Carolina to help those folks, we were able to take that with us, improvise quickly, and have mobile data and voice communication. So we could text, we could look at a map to see where the heck we were going. We could do all those things, right? So innovation is a popular buzzwordy phrase these days, and there's true innovation. I think companies do it best when they allow people to innovate from the bottom up. I think that's extraordinarily important for the leadership of companies, structurally and scheduling wise and everything that goes into it. How do you give space and time for those bottom up innovations to see the light of day? And I'm a big fan of this concept of having a small team that's broken off and doesn't have a day-to-day duty necessarily, other than thinking about how to innovate for the company. And I think Safi Bakal's book, Loon Shots, he talks about this. And I'm a big fan of that book, of his thought leadership. And I try to implement that in a couple of places where I had the opportunity to serve. And I encourage companies to do that now. Innovation, again, ahead of time, thinking through, okay, we have this risk identified. We have a suite of tools at our disposal to help with it. But then what are those ways that the current environment or the current business world or our competitors or whomever aren't thinking of, and allow your organization? You've no doubt, hopefully, all of your listeners and all the companies that you work with and are out there doing good things, they've brought good people in. And by bringing good people into their organization, they brought in people who have some really good ideas on how to innovate and make things better within that organization, both for the here and now, and then for predicting and trying to analyze and mitigate risk moving forward.
Yeah, I love that you're advocating for sort of the commander's action group for business, a team that can do some of that thinking for you, because so often leaders think, I have to have all the answers. I have to be the one that figures it out. But yeah, you have some really smart people that work for you that are out there gaining new perspectives, talking to people in your company, helping you move the ball forward.
Super important. And how does, in a large organization, how do you talk to the new hire who's been on board 6 months? And maybe if you're a hierarchical organization and not very flat, which many companies are, that's just how they're structured. And I get it. Sometimes that's the best way. How do you reach down to Cassie, who's a 25-year-old, maybe brand new college graduate who has some really good ideas? How do you get that up through the layers of bureaucracy? And that you just have to figure out organizationally how to do that, to give that space and time to those great ideas. And there's a lot of different
Yeah.
ways to do it, but you got to think about how to implement that.
Yeah, and be willing to break some glass.
Yes, 100%. 100%.
So, Trevor, through this experience, I've heard a lot about your community. I'm really curious what you learned about the resilience of your community. And also, if there were any moments that surprised you or inspired you throughout this where people came together to support one another.
Yeah. So, the closest analog to what I think we experienced after Hurricane Helene is very similar to what our nation experienced after 9/11, meaning obviously that was a catastrophic event, nation and worldwide impacts. This was more localized. I don't want to stretch the comparison, but the comparison really hits home when you think about how people started coming together and working towards a common goal. And that common goal was relieving the stress, the worry, the impacts of this storm. And so a couple things that I saw that were creative, were really that best face of humanity coming forward. One of the local airports, and I don't even know how it happened, as people started to get a little bit better communications, they would use social media, what can I say, social media for good. And they would put out a request and say, hey, we need water, we need baby formula, whatever it is, whatever that thing is. And we're collecting them. So we need volunteers to help bundle and package these things at this location adjacent to the runway. And then we need pilots. And then we need people to donate. And so all of that, again, bootstrapped. One of the local helicopter like tourist companies kind of led the way and said, I will be flying back and forth, so count me in. Then all of a sudden, if you had a private plane, a private helicopter, if you were so blessed to have those things, you were involved. And so we would almost every day for a period of time see what they needed, try to get it either from our friends, neighbors, or go to the store if the stores were open, depending on what they needed, bring it down. And there would be about a half-mile line of people pulling in to donate these supplies. There was another smaller team bundling and packaging. And then it was the damnedest thing. There was just a line of dozens of helicopters and planes. I didn't know there were that many private aircraft in the area. I know people were flying in from all over to be part of this small air force, and they would take off and fly to North Carolina and drop the supplies or drop wherever was needed. Incredibly impactful, and it's something that no government entity organized. This was all the local people saying this is something we need to do, and in high degree of resilience there. That was amazing. I also saw private organizations. The National Guard did an extraordinary job getting on scene quickly, but then a lot of the heavy lift was done by private organizations. And we were able to tie into those. When we were up in North Carolina, one of the organizations called Aerial Recovery. There was Samaritan's Purse on the ground, Team Rubicon, some of these organizations that often are veteran led and predominantly manned by veterans, not exclusively. The Cajun Navy was up there, and these organizations that have it in their DNA to go out and help people around the world, wherever those crises take place. And so they were up there trying to move to whatever location needed help. And that was truly extraordinary because it's all volunteer. It's not paid. And so they're out there and they're saying, I'm going to come help you. And I'm doing it purely because you're a fellow American and I'm going to be called to help you. And so seeing that in action was extraordinarily impactful in terms of just understanding that amidst all the vitriol of our political season that we're in and everything that's going on, there are still lots of Americans who are willing to go put themselves in harm's way sometimes, depending on the situation. Certainly the Cajun Navy that was doing some fast water, swift water rescues was in harm's way, and others were too. But they're doing really, really amazing work. To put perspective, we were asked to go do essentially a health and welfare. Somebody called in and said, I think it was their grandparent was in an assisted living facility, and we can't reach him or her. So we went there and we found that it was a gentleman in this case, and he was fine. He ended up, the assisted living facility was far enough away from the floodwaters that they weren't impacted directly by it. But he shared the story, and the gentleman's probably 80 years old, 75, 80. And he says, I said, well, how did things go? And he said, well, we were okay. We went to the top floor of our building and we watched the storm. And he said, and he was getting choked up and understandably, he was saying, we watched 3 mobile home parks disintegrate in front of our eyes. The waters rose up and those mobile homes went downstream with people in them. And he was talking about watching people drown in front of them. There's a human level to, with all of social media and all the virtual interaction, which we can be very grateful. I'm glad to interact with you virtually on the podcast. but there's nothing that replaces that human connection and being able to go out there and bring some water to people, or even in our community here, do something where you can have that direct face-to-face human interaction. Nothing replaces it. And we need more of that in our country. And I think more of that and less trying to interact with people via social media or virtual means is a net positive for our nation.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, despite some very tragic times, what an incredibly inspiring story. Every time I interact with humans individually, it brings back this incredible sense of hope that, there is good out there in the world, that there are people doing things for each other, that communities do come together in times of crisis. This has been an incredible conversation. I appreciate you sharing these lessons. Hopefully, people can take, when we start thinking about crisis response, crisis communications, people can take some of these lessons forward and be inspired by your story and the story of others to step up when they know they need to. So thank you, Trevor.
Absolutely. I hope that the companies that I think are doing it well, if they're distributed, if they're virtual, they're coming together in person at least maybe once a quarter to have that face-to-face connection. I think it makes your companies better. I think you're making companies more effective. And for the leadership of the company, that's really where you're going to get to know your folks, your men and women out there who are doing great things. And that interaction is going to help them. It's going to help you, and it's going to ultimately help the companies out. So I think that that's a great point to take away, is that human interaction is critical.
Yeah, absolutely.